"That recliner stays with me," my son-in-law told the moving crew, pointing at the only chair my late wife ever sat in, and my daughter stood right beside him and nodded. I didn't say a word. I just kept folding the last of my shirts into a cardboard box. But 3 weeks later, when the registered letter showed up at their door, the two of them drove 40 miles to my new place at 6 in the morning, banging on the door, begging me to explain. Thank you for being here with me. Before I go on, I'd love to know where you're listening from today. Drop your town in the comments. It always amazes me how far these stories travel. And I'll say up front, some details have been changed for the telling, but the heart of it is real, and maybe there's something in it worth sitting with. I should have seen it the day they showed up with a U-Haul I never asked for. It was a Tuesday in late September, and I was standing in the kitchen of the house I'd lived in for 31 years, in a quiet town outside Dayton, Ohio. The coffee maker was doing that thing it does, sputtering, taking forever, and I was watching the leaves come down off the maple in the backyard, the one I'd planted the spring my daughter was born. I was 67 years old, 8 months a widower, and I was about to lose the house too, not because anybody made me, because I'd been told it was the smart thing, the safe thing, the thing a good father does. My wife passed in January. 41 years we had together. Her name doesn't matter for this story as much as the fact that she was the kind of woman who remembered every birthday, every anniversary, every kid in the neighborhood's name. When the cancer finally took her, it didn't take her slow. 6 weeks from the diagnosis, I held her hand in a hospital room with bad fluorescent lighting, and I told her I'd be fine, and she looked at me like she knew I was lying. After the funeral, I drifted. I'll be honest about that. The house got too quiet. I'd make coffee for 2 out of habit and pour 1 cup down the sink. My daughter started coming around more, which I was grateful for. She'd bring her husband, and they'd sit in the living room and talk to me about how I was holding up, and at first it felt like love. Maybe some of it was. I still don't know how much. My daughter was 38. Smart girl, always had been. She'd gone to Ohio State, married a man she met at her first job, and they had a boy, my grandson, who was 9, and who I loved more than I had words for. The husband, my son-in-law, was the kind of man who shook your hand a little too hard and called you Pops before he'd earned it. He sold commercial insurance, drove a leased Tahoe, always had an angle, even when he was just talking about the weather. It started with the money, the way it always does. About 3 months after the funeral, the two of them sat me down at my own kitchen table. My son-in-law had a folder. He always had a folder. He said he'd been looking at my situation, like I was a client, and he was concerned. The house was paid off, sure, but property taxes were going up. Heating that big place through an Ohio winter on my own, that was money down the drain. And what if I fell? What if my health went the way of my wife's? Who'd take care of things? He had a plan. Of course he did. I'd sell the house. The market was good, he said. I'd clear maybe $240,000 after everything. I'd move into the finished basement apartment they'd just put into their place over in the next county. It had its own entrance, its own bathroom. I'd be close to my grandson, and the proceeds from the house? I'd put that toward their mortgage and a renovation that would, and I'm quoting him here, build equity for the whole family. It just made sense, he said. Keep the money in the family instead of handing it to the bank. My daughter sat next to him with her hands folded and her eyes wet, and she said, Dad, we just want you close. We don't want to lose you too. And God help me, that's the part that got me. We don't want to lose you too. I want to stop here and tell you what I was actually thinking, because some of you are already yelling at your screen. I can hear you. Why would a grown man hand over $250,000 and the only home he had left? You're right to ask. I asked myself the same thing for months afterward. But here's the thing nobody tells you about grief. It hollows you out. It makes you desperate to belong to somebody. I had just lost the person who'd been my whole world for 4 decades. And my little girl was sitting across from me saying she wanted me close. I would have signed anything. I nearly did. I said I'd think about it. They didn't like that, but they smiled and said, of course, take your time. That was April. By June, the for sale sign was in my yard. I told myself it was the right call. I'd be near my grandson. I'd see him grow up. and I trusted my daughter. I'd raised her, hadn't I? I'd taught her to ride a bike on that very street, taught her to drive in the church parking lot, walked her down the aisle 11 years ago, and shaken that hard handshaking man's hand and welcomed him to the family. People don't do that to their own. That's what I thought. People don't do that to their own. The house sold in 9 days. A young couple with a baby on the way. I watched them walk through my rooms pointing at where they'd put things, and I had to go sit in my truck for a while. The closing was a strange thing. I signed where the title company told me to sign, and the wire went out. And I'll tell you exactly what happened to that money, because this is the part that matters. Of the $238,000 I cleared, I kept $60,000 for myself. That was supposed to be my cushion, my dignity, the thing my wife would have insisted on. The other $178,000 I handed to my daughter and her husband. He had me wire it directly to their account. Simpler that way, he said. No reason to move it twice. There was no paperwork, no agreement, no note saying it was a loan, no deed putting my name on the basement apartment, no contract about the renovation. I asked about it once. I'm not a complete fool. I said maybe we should put something in writing, just so it's clean. And my son-in-law looked at me with this wounded expression and said, "Pops, we're family. You really want lawyers in the middle of family?" My daughter touched my arm and said, "Dad, don't you trust us?" What was I supposed to say to my own daughter? Don't you trust us? So I let it go. That's on me. I'll own that till the day I die. I let it go. I moved into the basement in July. The first few weeks weren't bad. My grandson would thump down the stairs after school and we'd play cards, or I'd help him with his math, and for an hour or two I'd forget how much my chest hurt. My daughter would bring down a plate sometimes. It felt almost like the thing I'd been promised. Then the renovation started, and I started to understand. The money I'd given them, the $178,000, was supposed to go toward the mortgage and a modest update. What I watched go in over the next 2 months was not modest. A new kitchen with stone countertops that my son-in-law photographed from every angle for his phone. A deck off the back, big enough for the parties he liked to throw for his insurance buddies. A hot tub. I sat in my basement and listened to them christen that hot tub on a Saturday night with a dozen people up there laughing, and I thought about my wife rationing nothing, ever, because we'd been careful our whole lives, careful so there'd be something left. The mortgage, I found out later, never got a dime of it, but money's just money. I could have made peace with money. What I couldn't make peace with was the way I started to disappear. It happened slow, the way these things do. First, it was little stuff. My daughter stopped bringing down plates, said she was busy, which she was. Then my grandson stopped coming down, and one day I heard, through the floor, my son-in-law telling him, "Give Grandpa his space, buddy. Old people need their quiet." 9 years old, and they were teaching him I was a thing to be managed. Quiet to be given, a burden in the basement. I tried not to take it personal. I really did. I'd go up and offer to help with the yard, and he'd say he had a guy for that now. I'd offer to take my grandson to his ball games, and my daughter would say they had it handled and I should rest. I was 67, not 90. I'd worked maintenance for the school district for 35 years. My hands still worked. My back still worked. But they kept telling me to rest, like resting was a kindness, and I started to feel like a piece of furniture they'd agreed to store. I want to tell you about the night I really knew where I stood, because up until then I'd been making excuses for them. After this, I couldn't anymore. It was a Thursday in early September. I'd had a bad afternoon. My blood pressure had been climbing, and I'd gone up to the kitchen to get some water and sit at a real table for a few minutes. Because the basement was getting to me. My daughter and her husband were in the den, and they didn't hear me come up. The TV was on low, and I heard him say my daughter's name, and then he said, "Look, all I'm saying is the basement's the best square footage in the house. Once your dad's not around, that's a rental. That's $1,200 a month, easy." And I stood there with my hand on the cabinet, and I waited for my daughter to say something. To tell him to stop, to say, "That's my father you're talking about." And she said, "I know, but we can't exactly kick him out now." It looked terrible. Not, he's my dad and I love him. Not, he gave us everything. It had looked terrible. Like I was a public relations problem. Like the only thing keeping me in that house was how it would play to the neighbors. I went back downstairs. I didn't get my water. I sat on the edge of the bed in that basement, the bed I'd brought from the house I'd sold to pay for their hot tub, and I put my face in my hands, and for the first time since the funeral I cried. Not for my wife. For my daughter. For the little girl I'd taught to ride a bike, who'd grown into a woman who'd let a man talk about her father like he was square footage waiting to come available. That night I didn't sleep. I lay there and I thought about my wife and what she'd say. And I knew exactly what she'd say because she'd said it to me 100 times about 100 things. She'd say, "You've got more sense than this, and you're letting them make you small. Stand up." So the next morning I started paying attention. Quietly. Here's something 35 years in maintenance teaches you. You notice what other people walk right past. The leak nobody sees till the ceiling falls in. I started noticing. I noticed the renovation contractor's truck, and one afternoon when my son-in-law wasn't home, I went out and made friendly conversation with the foreman, a guy named Thomas, told him I was the father-in-law, asked how the job was going. He told me more than he should have. He told me the whole job, kitchen, deck, hot tub, all of it, had run about 95,000. He told me it had been paid in cash, in installments, by my son-in-law. 95,000. I'd given them 178. So where was the other 83? And where was the mortgage payoff that was supposed to be the whole point? I'm not a detective. But I am a careful man, and I had nothing but time down in that basement. I started keeping a notebook. Dates, numbers, the things I overheard. I'd been adding my son-in-law on one of those social apps months back to see pictures of my grandson, and I started actually looking at what he posted. A fishing boat in May. A trip to Cabo in July. The same month I moved into the basement, the same month they told me they couldn't afford to pay a landscaper for me. His and hers watches he posted in August with some caption about investing in memories. Investing in memories. With my house. And then I found the thing that changed everything, and I found it by accident, which is how you find the important things. My grandson came down one evening. Snuck down, really, because he wasn't supposed to, and he was upset. Some kid's stuff. A bad day at school, and he wanted his grandpa, and that broke my heart and healed it at the same time. We talked it out, and before he went back up, he said real quiet, "Grandpa, are you going to move into the home?" I said, "What home, buddy?" And he said, "The old people home. Mum and Dad were talking about it. They said after the holidays." After the holidays. I kept my face calm for that boy, because he was scared, and I wasn't going to put my anger on him. I told him nobody was going anywhere, and I tucked him back up the stairs. But inside, something had gone very cold and very still. The kind of still I imagine my son-in-law felt right before every deal he ever closed. They were going to take my money, take my house, store me in a basement until it didn't look terrible anymore, and then move me into a facility and rent the square footage. And they'd have done it with my own grandson watching, learning that this is what you do with the old. That's when I stopped grieving and started thinking. The first thing I did was call my late wife's cousin, a man I'll just call my old friend, because he'd been a real estate attorney for 30 years before he retired down to Florida. I told him everything. The wire, the no paperwork, the basement, the after the holidays. There was a long silence on the phone, and then he said something I've never forgotten. He said, "You gave them a gift, legally speaking, because there's no note, but a gift given under a promise that's then broken. That's where it gets interesting. Don't sign anything, don't agree to anything, and get out of that basement before they make it look like you live there by their charity." I asked him what he meant about the basement. He said, "Right now, the story they can tell is that they took in a poor old widower out of kindness. You need to change the story before they tell it. You need to be a man who left, not a man who was kept." So I left. I want you to understand how I left, because this is the part where I stopped being a victim. I didn't make a scene, I didn't yell. 35 years fixing other people's messes taught me that the loudest guy in the room is almost never the one who wins. I waited until a Monday when both of them were at work and my grandson was at school. I called a moving company, a real one, with a truck and uniforms. I'd already found a place, a clean little 2-bedroom rental in a 55 and over community on the other side of Dayton, paid the deposit out of my $60,000 cushion. I packed my things, not their things, mine. My clothes, my tools, my books, my wife's recliner, that green recliner she'd sat in every evening of our marriage, the one thing in this world I would have gone to war over. And that's when my son-in-law came home early. I don't know why he came home early that day. Maybe a deal fell through. He came down those basement stairs and saw the boxes and the moving men, and his whole face changed. And the first thing out of his mouth, the very first thing, before "Are you okay?" before "What's going on?" before anything a human being would say, he pointed at the recliner the men were carrying and he said, "Whoa, whoa, that recliner stays. That's part of the house now." "Part of the house, my wife's chair," I said. "This chair came from my house. It's mine. Everything in these boxes is mine." He got on the phone and called my daughter, and 20 minutes later she came flying in, and the two of them stood at the bottom of those stairs and tried to stop me, not with their hands, with their words, which were worse. My daughter said, "Dad, you can't just leave. What will people think?" There it was again, what will people think? And my son-in-law, smelling money slipping away, said, "We had an arrangement. You can't just walk out on an arrangement." I set down the box I was holding. I looked at him, and then I looked at my daughter, and I said the only thing I'd planned to say. I said, "Show me the arrangement. In writing. Show me one piece of paper." And neither of them could, because there wasn't one. He'd made sure of that himself. No reason to move it twice. We're family. You don't want lawyers in the middle of family. The movers finished loading. I carried the recliner to the truck myself. My son-in-law followed me out into the driveway, and his voice changed. Got soft, got reasonable, got salesman. "Pops, come on. Let's talk about this. We're family. Whatever's bothering you, we can work it out." I got in my truck. I rolled down the window, and I told him the second thing I'd planned to say, the thing my wife would have wanted me to say. I said, "You'll be hearing from my attorney." And I drove away, and I watched in the mirror as the two of them stood in that driveway they'd built with my wife's careful savings, getting smaller and smaller. Now, I told you at the start that 3 weeks later, they came banging on my door at 6 in the morning. Let me tell you what happened in those 3 weeks, because it wasn't magic, and it wasn't revenge in the way the word usually means. It was just the truth, finally written down on paper. My wife's cousin, my old friend the attorney, he didn't take the case himself. Retired, and 3 states away, but he made some calls and got me in front of a sharp younger lawyer right there in Dayton, a woman who did elder financial abuse, which I hadn't even known was a thing with its own name. I told her the whole story and showed her my notebook, and she got very quiet and very focused. She told me some things I want to share with you, because there might be somebody listening who's where I was. She told me that in Ohio, like a lot of states, when you transfer a large sum of money to family with a clear understanding of what it's for, and they take the money and don't do the thing, that's not just a broken promise. There are doctrines for it. She used words like unjust enrichment and promissory estoppel, and I won't pretend I followed all of it. But the gist was this. The law does not assume that a 67-year-old widower simply gifted his entire net worth to a son-in-law for a hot tub. The law wants to know what was promised, and we could prove what was promised because, and here's the thing, my son-in-law was sloppy. Salesmen always are. He'd put it in texts, months of them. "Once we get the basement sorted, you're set for life, Pops. This renovation is an investment in your future too. The money's working for the whole family." He'd written it all down himself, building my case for me, because he was so sure I'd never have the spine to use it. She told me something else. She said the renovation, paid in cash, with money that came from me, where some of it went to the contractor, and some of it just vanished. That was the kind of thing that, if it ever got in front of a judge, raised questions my son-in-law would not enjoy answering, especially the missing $83,000. Especially the Cabo trip and the watches and the boat, all bought in the months right after my wire cleared. We sent a letter, that's all it was. A registered letter, demand for accounting and return of funds, on a law firm's letterhead, laying out the dates and the amounts and the texts. No threats, just facts. Facts have a weight that threats never do. That letter is what landed on their doorstep. And that's why, 3 weeks after I drove out of that driveway, my daughter and her husband were pounding on my door at 6 in the morning. I let them stand out there a minute. I'm not proud of that, but I let them stand out there in the cold a minute, because I'd stood in a cold basement for 2 months. Then I opened the door. My son-in-law had his hands out, palms up, doing the reasonable man act. He started in about how this was all a misunderstanding, how we were family, how there was no need to get litigious, that ugly word. My daughter just looked at me. And she'd been crying, real crying, not the wet-eyed performance from my kitchen table back in the spring. She looked like my little girl again, and it nearly undid me. She said, "Dad, please, why are you doing this?" And I want to tell you, I had a whole speech ready. I'd practiced it in the shower for 3 weeks. About the basement and the square footage and the after the holidays and the recliner. All of it. And standing there looking at her, I let all of it go. And I said just one thing. I said, "You let him call your mother's chair part of the house. That's all." And my daughter's face came apart because she knew exactly what I meant. Not the chair. The chair was never the point. The point was that somewhere along the way, she'd let her father become an asset to be allocated, and her mother's memory become a piece of furniture, and her own son become a boy who asks if grandpa's going into a home. We didn't fix it on that doorstep. I want to be honest with you, because the stories where everybody hugs and the music swells, those aren't usually how it goes. My son-in-law kept trying to talk numbers even then, even with his wife falling apart next to him. And that told me everything I'd ever need to know about him. I told them both to talk to my lawyer, and I closed the door, and I sat down in my wife's recliner in my own quiet place, and I shook for a while. The legal part resolved over the next few months, and I'll keep it simple. Faced with those texts and that missing money, and an attorney who clearly knew exactly what she was doing, my son-in-law's bluster evaporated the way it always does with men like that. They settled. I got back 120,000 of the 178. Not all of it, because some was truly spent and gone, but enough. Enough to know I hadn't been a fool forever, only for a season. My lawyer said we could have pushed for more, maybe gotten there. But there was my grandson to think about. There's always somebody innocent in the middle. And that's the part I actually want to leave you with, because it's not about the money. It was never about the money. My daughter and her husband separated that spring. I won't say the lawsuit caused it, but a marriage where one person can talk about renting out a grieving father's room while the other lets it slide. That was a house with a bad foundation long before I sent a letter. He moved to Columbus, and my daughter, with the settlement and the marriage both behind her, showed up at my door one evening alone with my grandson, and she didn't have a speech either. She just stood there. It's taken time. It's still taking time. Trust. Once you've watched it walk down a flight of basement stairs and tell a 9-year-old to give Grandpa his space. You don't get that back in an afternoon. But she comes around now, and she's the one bringing the plates, and she sits in the kitchen at a real table with me, and a few weeks ago she said, "Out of nowhere, I'm sorry I let him make you small." My wife's words, almost exactly. And I never told her those were her mother's words. Maybe she just knew. My grandson is 11 now. He's down at my place most weekends. He sits in his grandmother's green recliner like he owns it, which he sort of does, and we play cards. And I am teaching him the one thing I most need him to know, which is not how to make money, because anybody can learn that, and the men who are best at it are often the emptiest. I'm teaching him that you take care of the people who took care of you, that you don't measure a person by their square footage. That family isn't a leverage point. It's the whole point. I'm 68 now. I've got my own place, my own door, my own quiet, that nobody gives me as a favor. I've got my wife's chair by the window where the morning light comes in, and some mornings I sit in it and I talk to her, and I tell her I finally stood up. I think she knows. If you're still with me here at the end, I want to ask you something, and I really do read these. If you found yourself where I was, handing everything to the people you trust most, and then watching them turn you into a problem to be managed, Would you have had the nerve to drive away? Or would you have stayed in the basement because leaving looked terrible? There's no wrong answer. I almost stayed myself. And if there's an older person in your life who's gone quiet lately, who's gotten small, who keeps telling you they're fine, go sit at a real table with them. Ask them the question nobody asked me for the longest time. Just ask if they're okay, and then sit still long enough to hear the truth. It costs you nothing, and it might be the thing that saves them. That's my story. I hope yours has more grace in the middle than mine did, and the same peace at the end.